In our lead story today, we're going to travel to Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has found himself increasingly under political siege. Though war still rages in the Palestinian territory of Gaza, Netanyahu's challenges have increasingly come from the home front, as the PM's fragile hold on his political fortunes appears to be growing increasingly weaker. The trouble Netanyahu faces at home is not the sort of thing that's contained to a single misstep or an isolated crisis, but there is a distinct moment over the last couple of weeks when Netanyahu's already precarious situation went from bad to worse. That moment came on Sunday the 9th of June, when a major Israeli political leader named Benny Gantz resigned from Netanyahu's war cabinet. Gantz is a very high-profile figure in Israel and a career military man, and although he's widely considered to be Netanyahu's most potent political opponent, he spent months working alongside Netanyahu since shortly after the Hamas terror attacks of October the 7th, 2023. The war cabinet, consisting of Gantz, two other members, and a pair of advisors, had been one of Gantz's demands to Netanyahu at the start of the war, attempting to force the PM to moderate his decisions through a small decision-making body in order to counteract the influence of far-right parliamentarians on the PM. But in the weeks leading to his resignation, Gantz has expressed serious frustrations with Netanyahu, accusing him of drawing out the war against Hamas in order to avoid new elections in which he would likely lose his position and dodge a corruption trial that's waiting for him when he leaves office. Gantz demanded that Netanyahu endorse the comprehensive peace plan currently being pushed by America's Biden administration, or which we've written a separate episode about if you're curious. And when Netanyahu refused that, Gantz left the war cabinet alongside one of the two advisory members who also resigned. That advisory member, a former general and political moderate named Gadi Eisenkot, said in his own resignation address that the Israeli government, quote, had failed completely in every objective. Gantz's resignation created an empty seat on the war cabinet, one that immediately fell under the focus of one Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's Israel's Minister of National Security and the leader of a far-right, ultra-nationalist political party called Jewish Power. He and his allies in Israel's far-right have been a critical part of Netanyahu's current governing coalition, which most experts on Israeli politics regard as the furthest right-leaning coalition in the nation's modern history. Yet despite Ben-Gvir's power, he's a person Netanyahu has worked to keep at arm's length, wary of the degree to which Ben-Gvir and his allies will be able to strong-arm Netanyahu if the PM loses support from other political partners. Yeah, Netanyahu took a similar approach. 8 days after Gantz resigned from the war cabinet, Netanyahu announced that it would be dissolved rather than filling Gantz's vacant seat. Thus, Ben-Gvir was denied the post and denied leverage over the direction of the war, at least for the time being. Instead, Netanyahu informed his ministers that he would hold conversations with his own advisors in the government and present his decisions to the security-oriented members of the cabinet. Within Israel, the tone of events appears to have given Netanyahu greater latitude to continue the war in Gaza as he sees fit. That's something that Netanyahu is broadly understood as being incentivized to do, as both domestic and foreign observers within Israel increasingly agree with the perception Benny Gantz had voiced while resigning from the war cabinet, that Netanyahu is incentivized to prolong the war and seeks to do so in order to remain in power. But Gantz's departure and the resulting political shakeup have meant that political moderates in the government have moved away from the PM, unbalancing his political coalition and making his political survival all the more dependent on those same far-right elements that Netanyahu seemingly wanted to keep away from the war cabinet. This sequence of events doesn't grant Ben-Gvir and his allies the same direct leverage that they would have gotten with a war cabinet appointment, but it increases their sway over Israel's government in a much broader way. With that influence, a successful set of ceasefire negotiations seems less and less likely, while voices advocating an even more devastating wartime strategy and a potential long-term reoccupation of Gaza get significantly more powerful. Ben-Gvir, along with Finance Minister and religious Zionist party leader Bezalel Smotrich, have threatened to bring down the whole government if Israel proceeds in negotiating a ceasefire, something that Netanyahu now appears loath to do. But the collapse of Netanyahu's war cabinet wasn't the only problem that the PM faced in recent days, far from it. On Sunday, the 16th of June, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, made an announcement of a new policy in southern Gaza. Per the IDF, the military would enact a so-called tactical pause each day for the foreseeable future across a stretch of about 12 kilometers, that's 7.4 miles of road in the area in and around the city of Rafah. Across Rafah, intense fighting has seen the IDF hunt down and attempt to destroy the few remaining organized brigades of Hamas fighters, but has led to yet another worsening of the humanitarian crisis that has already brought Gaza to the brink. Per the IDF, the daily pauses would last from 8 in the morning to 7 at night local time in order to allow mass amounts of humanitarian aid into the territory after after it had been delayed and backlogged for weeks. It's a much-needed step taken to enable aid trucks to utilize the critical Kerem Shalom crossing and address imminent starvation, intense malnutrition, and shortages of medical supplies, water, and other critical goods in Gaza. While the IDF was quite clear that this change would not amount to a ceasefire or even a stop in daily fighting, it was still a desperately needed relief valve, especially as Palestinians and Muslims around the world celebrate the holy days of Eid al-Adha. For anyone interested in seeing humanitarian aid finally flowing into Gaza, the IDF's pause was welcome news. Not enough to alleviate the worst of the starvation across the territory, but certainly enough to make an impact. The only trouble with that was that it apparently was announced and decided on without Netanyahu's approval. Quoting an unnamed Israeli source via several media organizations, quote, "When the Prime Minister heard the reports of an 11-hour humanitarian pause in the morning, he turned to his military secretary and made it clear that this was unacceptable to him." Apparently, Netanyahu was assured by military leaders that the IDF's policy had not actually changed and that, quote, "fighting in Rafah continues as planned." But Netanyahu was clearly put off by the decision. As he was quoted saying to Israeli media later that day, "We have a country with an army, not an army with a country." The move fell under intense fire from Netanyahu's far-right allies, with the aforementioned Itamar Ben-Gvir calling for the firing of whomever ordered the daily pause. Although it does not appear to extend directly into Rafah and instead opens a humanitarian line of support on the periphery of the city, it still drew the ire of pro-war factions incensed at the idea of a pause. Making matters worse, it was announced one day after the deaths of 8 Israeli soldiers in an armored carrier in the same part of Gaza, and as news of Hamas tunnels from Rafah to Egypt and the militant terror group's persistent use of civilian targets to hide their military infrastructure stream out of the city from the Israeli side. At the time of writing, it appears the daily pause has yet to be cancelled by Netanyahu's administration, although how long it may persist is yet unknown. Just days prior to the IDF's tactical pause, Netanyahu received even more bad news. In the form of an interview by Hamas spokesman that since heightened fears within Israel around over 100 hostages still held captive by Hamas. The interview aired on Thursday, the 13th of June, where Hamas spokesman Osama Hamdan was asked by a CNN reporter how many hostages were still alive in Gaza. The response: "I don't have any idea about that. No one has any idea about that." The statement lit yet another spark of discontent within Israel, where the government still enjoys broad popular support in waging war against Hamas, but a bitter and growing protest movement has heavily criticized Netanyahu for not doing enough to bring the hostages home. Days before that interview aired, Israel did recover 4 hostages from Gaza, but during that recovery operation, at least 274 Gazans were killed, including 64 children and 57 women, per the Gaza Health Ministry and Gaza's media office, with around 700 wounded. Per the IDF, Hamas did offer fierce resistance, but per a wide range of sources, the death toll far exceeded the Hamas fighters' presence. Not only did the surrounding civilians come under fire from Israeli Special Force commandos, but many were killed when a barrage of Hellfire missiles tore into nearby crowds during the daytime raid, clearing a bloody path for Special Forces to withdraw with the hostages. At present, Israel estimates that at least a third of the remaining 120 or so hostages have died in captivity, and with even Hamas now stating that it has been unable to keep track of the hostages, the idea that Israel could track the survivors down in time now appears even harder to accomplish via military means. Over 100 hostages have been freed via diplomacy, and just 7 so far by the IDF's military operations. All the while, Israel has come under much increased pressure from foreign allies, foremost among them the United States. After months essentially providing Israel carte blanche cover to pursue its offensive, the US has begun to make more stringent demands of its ally, pushing toward that same comprehensive ceasefire that we referenced a moment ago. America has taken its concerns to the UN Security Council, where a full-throated endorsement of that ceasefire was agreed on by 14 out of 15 members and passed with an abstention from Russia. Europe continues to hold Netanyahu at a further and further length, while the nations of the continent continue to consider their options after Ireland, Norway, and Spain recognized Palestinian statehood last month. In advance of what promises to be a complicated and messy Paris Olympics, Israel's position around the world continues to move toward isolation, as the slow winnowing away of popular support for the IDF's war effort makes it more and more difficult for national leaders to continue endorsing the same sorts of near unconditional partnerships that many nations have shared with Israel for generations. And finally, one more fearsome specter looms over the Netanyahu administration. the prospect of yet more violence north of Israel's own territory, fighting against the Lebanese militant organization Hezbollah. Far better equipped, better supported, entrenched in the Lebanese government, and greater in numbers than the Hamas organization, Hezbollah nonetheless shares close ties to Hamas, linked together as critical parts of Iran's broader network of influence in the region. Hezbollah and Israel have traded bullets and bombarded each other with rockets and airstrikes nearly daily since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, but beginning on the 12th of June, Hezbollah has shown a far greater willingness to attack Israeli installations en masse. The prior day, Israel had killed a Hezbollah field commander in southern Lebanon, and on that Wednesday, Hezbollah fired over 200 rockets and other projectiles across the Israeli border in retaliation. The following day, they launched over 100 more, including attacks on specific Israeli military installations and a multi-drone assault on Israel's northern military headquarters. The 2 days represented Hezbollah's most serious attack on Israel since the Israel-Hamas war began, and while Israeli air defenses were able to ensure no casualties on the Israeli side, wildfires broke out on either side of the border, while Israeli strikes killed several in the Lebanese town of Janata. For outside observers, seeing Israel's struggles in placating its hostages and dismantling Hamas, the idea that Netanyahu would open another front in this war might be surprising, but this is a cycle of escalation the world has been waiting for the last several months. Despite Hezbollah's political role in the Lebanese government and their broad base of support in the southern part of the country, they are seen as a legitimate military target for Israel, and with Israel's 3 historic invasions of Lebanon all going basically to plan, it's far from inconceivable that Netanyahu and company would seek to push their forces northward in a larger assault. Indeed, the 19th of June saw Israel's foreign affairs minister, a man named Israel Katz, warn of an all-out war with Hezbollah after Hezbollah had published videos of its attacks on sensitive Israeli military outposts. Quoting Katz on social media platform X, "In our all-out war, Hezbollah will be destroyed and Lebanon will be severely hit. The state of Israel will pay a price on the front and home fronts, but with a strong and united nation and the full power of the IDF, we will restore security to the residents of the north." Making matters worse, Israel is eager to return some 80,000 displaced residents to northern districts where they've been forced to flee by Hezbollah rocket attacks, and it's widely understood that the objective will be hard, if not impossible, to achieve without broader military action to at least push Hezbollah out. So, that's the Israeli PM's situation, squeezed from all sides and taking steps that relieve the pressure, but make a longer conflict all the more likely. Netanyahu does have increased latitude to pursue an extended attritional war and occupation in Gaza, if indeed that's what he seeks to accomplish. He can track down hostages at the same rate that's seen Israel return fewer than 1 per month via military means, a pace that would imply a war of over a decade if that rate of recovery holds steady. He can even extend his war to Hezbollah in the north, opening another round of bitter violence and ensuring that he's shrouded in the protection of his wartime powers. But with moderate partners now abandoning his coalition, Netanyahu is left with fewer and fewer off-ramps from the war and significantly reduced means to moderate his nation's conduct as that war continues. In the short term, he protects his position, guarding against elections at a time when some 3 out of 4 Israelis believe that he should be ousted from his position. But in the long term, he signs up for a long war that has seen Israel move towards pariah status on the world stage, overseen an incredible amount of wartime atrocities, and may well make his domestic political situation worse when the war either ends or there's nothing left of Gaza to wage war against. If Netanyahu seriously intends to lead Israel until his eventual demise, and he can make such a thing happen, then perhaps he may avoid the consequences that he seems to fear by ending his time in office. But in all likelihood, Netanyahu will have to step down sooner or later, and the decisions he and his coalition make today are likely to only make the consequences worse in the long run. Higher consequences later, it stands to reason, will lead to greater desperation in the months and years to come, and a desperate leader waging such a brutal war on a people that broadly lack the means to defend themselves is a recipe for a far worse sort of disaster. Next up today, we turn our attention to Armenia. In terms of stories falling under the banner important but not particularly shocking, it'd be hard to come up with a story that was both more important and less shocking than the announcement recently made by Armenia's Prime Minister. On June the 12th, Nikol Pashinyan declared that his country would be withdrawing from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a kind of Eastern NATO dominated by Russia. Although Pashinyan kept his statements vague, not even committing to a timetable for the withdrawal, it was still big news. Existing in various forms since the mid-1990s, the CSTO has long been a key tool of Moscow's foreign policy, a way to keep as many post-Soviet states tied together as possible. Its 6 current members include not only the European nations of Russia, Armenia, and Belarus, but also the Central Asian states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. For decades, Armenia was among the most enthusiastic participants. During Russia's intervention in Syria, Armenia was the only CSTO state to send soldiers, albeit purely as part of a demining team. Clearly then, Yerevan pulling out from the organization was a big geopolitical story, but it was also one that the world saw coming a mile off. That's because Armenia under Pashinyan has been souring on the Russian-dominated organization, specifically on its inability to help its members. The story began with the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020. That September, longtime foe Azerbaijan launched an unexpected assault on Nagorno-Karabakh, a de facto independent ethnically Armenian enclave situated within Azerbaijan's internationally recognized territory. The 44 days that followed saw Azerbaijan use drones to devastating effect, eventually conquering nearly 3/4 of the disputed territory. Although the CSTO wasn't obliged to intervene, its mutual defense policy only covered Armenia proper, Yerevan was still stung by the organization's unwillingness to get involved, a feeling that would only grow 2 years later when the conflict reignited. Although short, the 2022 skirmishes around Nagorno-Karabakh saw Azeri forces shell villages inside Armenia proper and even launch a brief armed incursion across the border. When Yerevan appealed to the CSTO, nothing happened. As the Center for European Policy Analysis bluntly put it, the Kremlin sat on its hands and refused to act. Even worse was to come. In the fall of 2023, Azerbaijan launched a final assault on Nagorno-Karabakh. The territory was conquered and 100,000 ethnic Armenians were expelled. Although Azeri forces killed 5 Russian peacekeepers stationed there, the Kremlin not only refused to act, but it also seemed to revel in Yerevan's defeat. Inside Armenia, the humiliation of 2023 was the last straw. Since then, Yerevan has refused to either pay its CSTO fees or send a representative to meetings. As such, the withdrawal announcement earlier this month can be seen as just the logical culmination of a long falling out, the final divorce of a couple whose marriage had years ago sunk into bitterness. Only this breakup would come with a twist, one that wasn't just surprising, but threatened to completely shake up geopolitics. Shortly after his initial announcement, Pashinyan claimed that members of the CSTO were, in his words, planning a war against us with Azerbaijan. At first, this just seemed like so much hot air, a restatement of Yerevan's grievances over Nagorno-Karabakh with a dash of hyperbole thrown in for good measure. Until, that is, Politico got its hands on some leaked documents and published them on June 13th. Documents that proved fellow CSTO member Belarus had supplied Azerbaijan with the weapons and training to conquer the ethnically Armenian enclave. This was less a bombshell revelation than it was a full-on nuclear warhead of secrets. The documents detailed a program of weapons transfers from Minsk to Baku that ran from 2018 to 2022 and included some of the drone and artillery systems used against Nagorno-Karabakh. Worse, the leaks revealed that the Belarusians knew what the Azeris were going to use those weapons for. One diplomatic cable Politico published acknowledged that Minsk was playing an active role in, quoting, the restoration of deoccupied territories of Azerbaijan. Now, it's no surprise that Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko might prefer Azerbaijan over Armenia. In 2022, he was quoted calling Azeri President Ilham Aliyev our man. Yet, the publication of evidence that Minsk actively colluded with a non-CSTO member to attack a treaty ally was on another level. In NATO terms, it would be like discovering that Hungary had secretly funneled weapons to Serbia, which Belgrade had then used to conquer Kosovo and shell towns inside NATO member Albania. At a bare minimum, you would expect Budapest to get kicked out of the alliance if such a thing became public. But when Pashinyan demanded Belarus either apologize or be expelled from the CSTO, the other members simply shrugged. Given Belarus's long border with Ukraine, it was always a long shot that Vladimir Putin would discipline his wayward puppet, and all of this left Yerevan with little choice. It seems unlikely that Pashinyan's withdrawal announcement was simply showboating. Speaking to the opposition outlet Moscow Times, 2 anonymous Russian officials and 1 CSTO official all agreed that, quoting here, the chances of preventing an Armenian exit are slim. Such an outcome will be causing sleepless nights in both Yerevan and Moscow. The trouble for Armenia is that the Kremlin will likely want to coerce it into remaining and punish it if it leaves. And Putin has lots of levers that he can pull without resorting to force. For one thing, Russia is Armenia's top trading partner. Moscow could cause deep pain by simply throwing up tariffs. For another, much of the Armenian economy is owned by Russian oligarchs or Russian state entities. Geopolitical Monitor notes that Russian companies dominate Armenia's banking, transport, and energy sectors, including ownership of the gas distribution system and running the nation's sole nuclear power plant. In short, Armenia ending things with Russia could come with a hefty price tag, one that might cause enough economic pain to destabilize the whole country. On the flip side, though, the idea of an Armenian CSTO exit is also a nightmare for Moscow. At present, Yerevan is the Kremlin's one ally in the South Caucasus. While Georgia's government is edging closer to Russia, its population remains deeply opposed to Moscow following the 2008 war. And while Azerbaijan is good friends with Russian puppet Belarus, it's even better friends with the nation Moscow fears most of all in the region, Turkey. A growing military power, Turkey has a long history of challenging Russian dominance in the South Caucasus. While the two nations sometimes work together, neither Putin nor President Erdogan are under any illusion that their countries are rivals. At present, Armenia is supposed to be Moscow's bulwark against Turkish ambitions, a country that's in the CSTO and allows the Kremlin to maintain strategically important bases on its territory. Should Yerevan follow through on its threats to withdraw, then Moscow will be left feeling dangerously exposed in what it regards as its backyard. That goes double if Armenia tries to compensate for its CSTO exit by cozying up to NATO countries. Already, France is trying to step into the vacuum, with Paris agreeing on June the 18th to sell Armenia Caesar 155mm self-propelled howitzers, a move that's already raising Russian hackles. From a wider geopolitical perspective, though, perhaps the most important thing about Armenia's pending exit from the CSTO isn't the way it'll change the security balance in the South Caucasus. No, it's what it might say about the future of the entire organization. Originally conceived as a sort of NATO alternative, the CSTO has lost members before. Georgia and Azerbaijan both quit an earlier version in 1999, while Uzbekistan has so far managed to join and then quit twice. But this time could be different. Not only was Armenia once an enthusiastic member, but its potential departure points towards a brutal truth. The CSTO may not be capable of offering its members any protection. Just as American firepower dominates NATO, so too does Russian firepower dominate the CSTO. But while a NATO that loses America would still include the British and the French nuclear arsenals, Germany's economic might, and Poland's rapidly expanding ground forces, the CSTO without Russia simply would not exist. Everything it does is at the sole discretion of Moscow, and that has worrying implications for the organization's other members. In their article reporting on the leaked documents showing Belarusian arms transfers to Azerbaijan, Politico interviewed Russian security expert Ivana Stradner. According to her, there is no way Belarus could have been doing such a thing without the Kremlin's approval. In her words, it's ridiculous to think these transfers could have taken place without Moscow's knowledge, and that Russia couldn't have stopped them if it wanted to. If that's the case, then these revelations will likely be sending a chill through the remaining members. After all, if Vladimir Putin is willing to turn his back on one of Russia's oldest allies, then it seems safe to say that he could do so again. Already, the Kremlin appears to be in the process of hanging Kyrgyzstan out to dry. In both 2021 and 2022, the CSTO failed to intervene during border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and fellow state member Tajikistan. In the second set of clashes, Tajik troops even crossed the border in what the Kyrgyz government called an invasion. Yet Putin not only failed to intervene, he also subsequently gave Tajik President Imamali Rahmon an award for the provision of regional stability and security. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Kyrgyzstan responded by cancelling planned CSTO military exercises. Even in the sole nation where the CSTO worked as intended, government interest is waning. Kazakhstan was the site of the CSTO's first major deployment, when in 2022 the organization sent 2,000 soldiers in to battle riots and mass protests brought about by a hike in fuel prices. Since then, though, President Tokayev has tried to balance maintaining ties with Russia with outreach to both the West and China. Just recently, for example, his nation hailed a new era of cooperation with South Korea. Last fall, the US opened a peacekeeping operations center in Almaty. And Xi Jinping has made no secret of Kazakhstan's centrality to his Belt and Road Initiative. These are the actions of a leader who is hedging his bets, who wants to keep Moscow on side, but is preparing the ground for a rapid pivot to either enter NATO or Beijing if things go south. A worry no doubt fueled, in part, by irredentist Russian claims on Kazakhstan's north. Now, these are only a couple of examples, but each speaks to a rot deep in the heart of the CSTO, a rot that seems to be spreading as Putin plays favorites and openly allows some members, such as Belarus and Tajikistan, to humiliate others. The irony is that NATO was the organization that Putin wanted to kill. A stated reason for his invasion of Ukraine was to drive the alliance back west and ensure no other European countries ever joined. Well, we all saw how that turned out. Since 2022, NATO has added 2 new members and seems more united than it has in decades. By contrast, the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs writes that the CSTO looks like a zombie, an undead creature shambling around the former Soviet Union, lacking a pulse but continuing to go through the motions of still being alive. Armenia's withdrawal may not signal the imminent collapse of the CSTO, but it does signal that Putin's cherished NATO alternative is slowly withering away. That many of its members are already looking for an exit strategy should the Kremlin one day decide to betray them, as it has Armenia. Next up, we travel to China, where a state-sponsored nuclear boom has seen the world's now second most populous nation become the world leader on nuclear energy. According to a new report by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Stephen Ezell, published on June the 17th, the United States now lags as many as 15 years behind China when it comes to developing high-tech nuclear power. Far from just a minor setback in a nuclear race that the American public isn't particularly intent on winning, the report's implications stretch past the bounds of civilian energy and well into the realm of geopolitical strategy and proliferation. The report illustrated just how powerful China's nuclear industry has become, with no fewer than 150 new nuclear reactors currently scheduled for completion within the next 11 years. By contrast, the United States has 94 operable nuclear reactors compared to 56 in France and 9 in the United Kingdom, with 36 in Russia, 23 in India, 33 in Japan. Right now, China boasts 55 operable reactors, generating some 5% of the country's total electricity, but it's on track to have over 200 in operation by the end of the window laid out in the report. 27 are currently under construction, and China is said to be able to build an average reactor in the span of just 7 years. That is far better than the average construction timeline of other world nations, and it is a pace that China's other construction initiatives in its cities and infrastructural campaigns indicate that it should be able to hit. In terms of the reactors China actually fields, the nation has fast become the global leader in the creation and installation of so-called small modular reactors, or SMRs. These are advanced reactors that can generate up to 300 megawatts per unit, a bit more than a third of what the largest reactors can produce, but they make up for their lower output with their utilitarian features. Physically small, hence their name, these reactors are able to be assembled in factories and transported for installation on small patches of land, making them far more affordable and easier to construct and open. They're ideal to bring to rural areas and essentially create an electrical grid from scratch, rather than having to link remote areas to a national grid, and they are considered to be much safer than large reactors with lesser refueling needs. At present, China does SMRs better than anybody, and they're designed in a way clearly intended to turn them into an export product abroad. And even the major reactors China is working on have the promise to be far more advanced than anything in the US, Europe, or Russia. China recently opened the world's first 4th-generation nuclear reactor, for which China insists that some 90% of the requisite technology was of indigenous Chinese design. 4th-generation reactors don't have a precise definition, but their generally agreed-upon characteristics include an energy yield roughly 100 times greater than 3rd-generation reactors with the same amount of nuclear fuel, waste that stays radioactive for centuries instead of millennia, and a suite of advanced safety and automated shutdown measures that most worldwide facilities can't hope to match. The 4th-generation plant China opens, the Shaidao Bay nuclear power plant in Shandong province, was commissioned in 2021 and will ultimately include 10 4th-generation reactors producing 210 megawatts of power per unit. The report calls out China's clear strengths in nuclear innovation and its dedication to pursuing small, incremental innovations that, when combined in aggregate, lead to the development of far superior end products. Per the report, China isn't alone in understanding the theory behind 4th-generation reactors or broader improvements to nuclear technology, but the nation excels at actually putting the theory into practice. In 2008, China held just 1.3% of the world's patents relating to nuclear energy. Today, they hold about 13.5% and are the world leader in patents relating to nuclear fusion technology. When it comes to scholarly research in the field, China is the global leader too, and the Chinese state has proven itself to be a critical backer for the national nuclear sector, leveraging a cohesive national strategy in a way that other nations can't match. As industry analyst Kenneth Luongo put it when quoted in the report, China doesn't, quote, have any secret source other than state financing, state-supported supply chain, and a state commitment to build the technology. technology. All of this would be taken as a warning sign by the United States, even at the best of times. But when it comes to nuclear energy, the US hasn't experienced the best of times in several decades. In the last 10 years, America has launched only 2 nuclear reactors, and a grand total of 0 more are currently in progress. In reality, nuclear energy is a safe, nearly emissions-free source of electricity, and many world nations, including the current political leadership of the United States, consider it to be a critical step in limiting global climate change. But it's also exceptionally easy to demagogue, much to the dismay of its proponents, and although 2023 polls by both Pew and Gallup found American support for more nuclear power plants in the mid to high 50s, its highest point in a decade, that shift in opinion has proved very difficult to convert into political action. And not only that, but common American perceptions of Chinese scientific development as a copycat industry stealing American intellectual property and replicating American innovation has led both the American public and their policymakers to ignore China's real-world progress in the nuclear field until reports like this one come along that shake up the entire landscape. Now, the report will, at best, be a wake-up call from the perspective of a nation that considers itself China's great rival, and at worst, is going to fall on deaf ears. Now, at the outset of this section, we promised that this was a nuclear issue that didn't just stop neatly at the outer edges of the civil sector, and this is the part where we deliver on that. On the same day as the report that we've been referencing was published, another, apparently unrelated report came out via the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. In the report, SIPRI estimated that over the course of 2023, China's nuclear arsenal grew by nearly 25%, from 410 warheads at the start of the year to 500 at the year's end. Per SIPRI, that number is expected to keep growing, and the 500 warhead threshold isn't the only milestone that China's passed. In the same year, China appears to have decided to begin placing warheads on missiles during peacetime, in a state of high operational alert that mirrors that of the United States or Russia. Speaking of the US and Russia, which lead the world in their nuclear military stockpile with some 3,700 and 4,400 deployed warheads and stored warheads respectively, China is on pace to pass them too. According to an associate senior fellow on WMDs at SIPRI, Hans Christiansen, quote, China is expanding its nuclear arsenal faster than any other country. How fast? Fast enough to have as many or more intercontinental ballistic missiles than Russia and the US by the end of this decade. And it's when we ask where the fissile material to fuel all those warheads comes from that the importance of China's advanced nuclear power industry comes into focus. One of the types of reactor that China is investing in is a so-called fast neutron reactor, or FNR. This is a type that uses the isotope uranium-238 in addition to the more standard uranium-235. 238 is the more naturally abundant form of uranium, and it's especially important for weapons production because while it's not much good in a civilian reactor, it can be bombarded with neutrons and turned into the much more potent isotope plutonium-239. Plutonium exists only in trace amounts in the natural world, and when it comes to making nuclear weapons, this is the good shit. Funnily enough, those FNR reactors that use uranium-238 just happen to be expected to yield up to 200 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium every single year, which is enough to supply 50 nuclear warheads. Again, that's the yield from just one FNR in just 1 year. China opens up its first in 2023, intends to open another one in 2026, and will be deciding whether or not to build an even bigger one in the next few years. It's in this way that China's advanced nuclear power industry feeds directly into China's role as a rising proliferator of nuclear weapons around the world, potentially granting it parity with the world's nuclear superpowers in hardly longer than the blink of an eye. And then there's the geopolitical implications that have less to do with hard power and more to do with soft power. If you've paid really any attention to geopolitics over the course of the last decade, then you'll likely be familiar with China's initiative to expand its global reach with a wide range of partner nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That initiative has been met with varying levels of success depending on where in the world we're talking about. But broadly, China's aggressive approach has backfired a bit. Relying on something called debt trap diplomacy, China has worked to basically entrap less powerful nations into a neat little exchange. China builds massive infrastructure projects basically for free and improves the conditions and economic power of a given nation. And in return, that nation is on the hook to pay China back for decades through everything from land lease to direct shipment of natural resources to loan payoffs. In 2023, the Associated Press reported that some of the countries most indebted to China, like Pakistan, Kenya, and Laos, have had to divert tax money away from schools, electricity, and more to pay off their benefactor while draining their currency reserves at the same time. Zambia and Sri Lanka even went into default over their loans. Seeing that, a whole lot of other world nations have rather fairly decided that there are better ways to throw away their GDP and stayed away from China's offers for the short term. But China's nuclear boom offers another route to build bridges with these less wealthy nations, and one that potentially cuts out all the big, bad, scary-sounding bits in order to offer a trade-off. The real magic here comes from the small modular reactors that we discussed earlier, the SMRs, the cost-competitive, easy-to-assemble, out-of-the-way reactors that you could say plop down in the middle of a city or in a remote region and basically sustain a power grid from scratch. That's likely to be a very tempting deal for world nations who can, for a relatively limited investment of their own money, pick up an SMR or 2 or 3 and take most of their national power woes about power supply off their plate. For especially underdeveloped nations, this is the kind of change that could bring massive proportions of the country onto the grid in a very short time, contributing to all the myriad health, entrepreneurial, sanitation, agriculture, and other benefits that come with consistent, reliable power sources. But those nations aren't the only ones who could see their fortunes change. Just look at South Africa, where despite relatively high development and relative prosperity, the country has been plagued with an energy crisis and rolling blackouts for years. You say energy shortfall of several gigawatts, and China says, problem that could be fixed by leasing a few dozen SMRs and plugging them into the existing power grid. Easy. Between China's potential to manufacture a mind-boggling number of nuclear warheads in a very short time and its ability to sell off easy-to-install, easy-to-run nuclear power plants in exchange for expanding its partnerships abroad, China's nuclear renaissance is among the most important geopolitical stories that's just not being told. On the nation's current pace, it's only a matter of time before the CCP are the undisputed kings of nuclear energy, and for both the conflicts and the peacetime global progress that comes next, that's a place that every powerful nation on Earth should desperately want to be. And for our final story today, we're traveling to the Central American nation of Honduras, where the government recently announced a raft of new measures to shore up its 18-month-old war on gangs. For those watching the broadcast on the night of June 14th, it must have sounded like the most comprehensive anti-crime package ever introduced. Speaking to the nation, President Xiomara Castro declared a plan of solutions against crime to combat what she characterized as a growing security emergency. Among initiatives to locate and destroy marijuana and coca leaf plantations, the president urged Congress to change the penal code to charge cartel members as terrorists, opening up the possibility of mass trials. She also said the security forces would urgently execute interventions across parts of the country with the highest incidences of gang crimes. But the headline measure, the one that attracted global media coverage, was the announcement of a new prison. Known as the Emergency Reclusion Center, the plan is for it to house 20,000 inmates in a remote eastern region. In many ways, this is a practical measure. Honduras's prisons are dangerously overcrowded, with nearly 20,000 already being held in buildings designed for a mere 13,000. In recent years, this has led to horrific massacres, including one at the National Women's Penitentiary for Social Adaptation last June that saw 46 female prisoners slaughtered. Yet it wasn't the practical side of the president's announcement that most of the world's media chose to focus on. Rather, it was the echoes of another famous mega prison built to hold gang members, the Terrorism Confinement Center in El Salvador. The largest prison complex in Latin America, the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT in its Spanish-language abbreviation, holds 40,000 suspected gang members in intentionally squalid conditions. As such, it has become a symbol of the anti-crime crackdown launched by Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele. Although controversial abroad, Bukele's crackdown is hugely popular at home thanks to its effectiveness. In 2018, El Salvador's murder rate stood at 51 per 100,000, higher than Mexico, higher than Colombia, higher than any Latin American nation except Venezuela. For comparison, the US murder rate that year was a mere 5 per 100,000. Since Bukele launched his war on gangs, the Salvadorian murder rate has plummeted. In 2023, it hit an all-time low of 2.4 per 100,000. That's only a little higher than the murder rate of Canada. Latin American-focused outlet Insight Crime summed up the drop this way, quoting here: "Homicides have fallen dramatically, and extortion has plummeted. These gains, however, have come at a cost. The government has arrested 1% of the population, suspended constitutional rights to due process, and is facing widespread allegations of torture and human rights violations. Now, Bukele is far from the first Latin American leader to have tried so-called mano dura policies. Multiple Mexican presidents, for example, have done similar things, yet Mexico's murder rate remains stubbornly high. The difference is that in El Salvador, it worked. In fact, it worked so well that it inspired imitators. Of these, the most famous is probably the president of Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, who launched his own version called the Noboa Way this January in response to a gangster uprising. As in El Salvador, the approach has made him insanely popular. A recent CB Consultora poll showed Noboa now has the highest approval ratings of any Latin American leader. Because of this, many were primed to see President Xiomara Castro's recent announcement through the lens of Bukele. Indeed, Semaphore reports that the two met beforehand to discuss his approach. However, those reporting that Honduras had suddenly lurched in the direction of El Salvador and Ecuador missed out on one crucial fact. Honduras had already been in a state of war with its gangs for a year and a half. The war kicked off back in December of 2022 when the government declared a state of emergency and suspended parts of the constitution. At that time, the Honduran murder rate stood at a grim 35.8 per 100,000, second only in the region to Venezuela. Writing in El País, one journalist later recalled how things felt, quoting, "Many Hondurans compared life in Tegucigalpa, the capital, to an open-air prison. Armed robberies and kidnappings occur on a daily basis. The streets are filled with tinted windows and the shanty towns are still controlled by the gangs." The BBC, meanwhile, described warlike levels of violence and pointed out that a woman was being murdered in Honduras every 28 hours, the highest rate in the Americas. This was the dark backdrop to the initial gang crackdown, one that was extended throughout 2023. At the time, observers compared it to the Salvadoran approach, with one important difference. In Honduras, the crackdown was only somewhat effective. It's true that homicides decreased by 13% across the year, leaving Honduras with a murder rate of 31.1 for 2023. However, it's also true that crime had already been trending down. While 2022 may have seen a state of emergency declared, it was an unusually peaceful year by Honduran standards. Homicides had dropped by 12% compared to 2021, with the nation's security ministry noting it hadn't seen so few violent deaths since 2006. And while 2023 was more peaceful still, it was still extremely violent by regional standards. This was the year, after all, of the prison massacre of 46 women, a year in which, according to El País, 90% of Honduran murders went unsolved. The impact of the state of emergency, then, may not have been all that dramatic. After a year of trying the El Salvador route, Honduras seemed to have experienced only small, localized effects. The Arms Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED, recorded a drop in violence in some of the most dangerous areas, such as Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula. Unfortunately, they also recorded violence rising in areas that had previously been relatively unaffected. Meanwhile, Insight Crime recorded a rise in both extortion and the cultivation of coca plants to make cocaine. This is the necessary background that we need to understand President Xiomara Castro's recent announcements. Rather than launching a new war on gangs, Honduras is simply intensifying a pre-existing crackdown in the hopes of turning the tide. And hey, maybe it'll work. After all, AP News reports that Honduran Security Minister Gustavo Sanchez announced that 2024 has so far seen a further 20% drop in murders. But we should also be prepared for it to follow a route closer to Ecuador's experiences than El Salvador's. There, Quito's crackdown has led to an overall decrease in homicides of 16% and a sharp improvement of the security situation in some provinces. The flip side is that other regions remain as violent as ever, while some cities even saw their murder rates increase. As research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Henry Zeimer recently noted in Global Americans, quoting here, "Unfortunately, recent reporting from Ecuador appears to suggest the Ecuadorian military has copied all of the brutality of the Bukele model without much of its success." If Honduras might be heading down the same route, then the most important question that we can ask is why? Why did mano dura work well in El Salvador, but less so in Honduras? One answer could be to do with geography. Compared to El Salvador, Honduras is big. A vast land of mountains, dense forest, and remote regions. Patrolling all that extra space would require resources that the cash-strapped government simply doesn't have. At the same time, journalist Jared Olson tells El País that Honduras sits on a prime route for overland drug smuggling. While cartels can avoid El Salvador, being able to cross Honduras is integral enough to their business that they're willing to fight for it. But While geography may play some part in Honduras' woes, there's likely a simpler explanation for the resilience of its gangs: corruption. Even by Central American standards, Honduras is a deeply corrupt society. How corrupt? Well, so corrupt that the police chief of San Pedro Sula is alleged to have moonlighted as a hitman for local gangs. Incite crime claims officers may have also orchestrated the murder of the country's anti-drug czar. At the same time, business and political elites often have shady ties to the cartels. Honduran journalist Wendy Funes has described how, quote, "the gangs are the hitmen and the muscle of the business, political, and military leadership." Now, it shouldn't be all that surprising. After all, former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who ruled from 2014 to 2022, was convicted this year in a US court for drug trafficking. The case showed he has links not only to local Honduran gangs, but also to Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. Still, the depths of elite corruption in Honduras remain shocking. The worst part? The handful of times the country has tried to do anything about it, the government arguably made the situation worse. Between 2011 and 2019, Honduras embarked on an ambitious purge of its police force, aiming to rid the institution of anyone linked to drug trafficking and gang activity. 6,000 officers were expelled from a force that originally numbered only 13,500. Unfortunately, the country then failed to embark on an aggressive hiring spree to make up for the shortfall. The result? A severely understaffed police force incapable of keeping the gangs in check. Here are some figures. According to the Organization of American States, Honduras has 173.3 police officers per 100,000 residents. Were Honduras an EU country, it would have the second lowest level of police officers on the continent after only Finland. But Honduras is not in Europe, a continent that has a block-wide average of only 0.86 homicides per 100,000. Instead, Honduras is trying to have European levels of policing while also suffering a murder rate worse than Mexico or Venezuela. By contrast, El Salvador has nearly 435 officers per 100,000 people. Now, we can't say for certain why Bukele's policies have yet to work in Honduras. It could be due to any of these factors or some combination. We should also note that just because they're not working now doesn't mean they won't work in the future. Perhaps President Xiomara Castro's latest clampdown will finally have the desired effect. Nonetheless, it's important that we try and understand the reasons why Bukele's policies can or can't be exported. Because as we've seen with Honduras and Ecuador, more and more Latin American leaders are trying to follow in his footsteps. Footsteps that can lead to some pretty dark places. The central conceit of El Salvador's Mano Dura policy is the trading of liberty for safety. The state strips away citizens' rights, and in return, they get levels of calm that were once unimaginable. Whether that trade-off is worth it or not is something people are free to argue over. But if the model doesn't work, if the state strips away rights but violence and murder rates remain sky high, then the way we weigh up that trade-off, it changes. It could be that what we're seeing in Honduras right now is a warning to Latin America, a warning that what worked well in one place may not work well in others. That for all the successes of El Salvador's model, it may be impossible to replicate it elsewhere. Only time will tell if the Honduran government's latest measures are capable of turning the tide or not.